natural stuff that's here. Our farmers had to deal with this. This is not a good piece of land to plow, even though they may have had some gardens, but this is great land for pasturing and so forth, and that's why you saw the stone wall. But the farmers had, and we talked about all the stone that would keep coming up and be such a problem. Well, in the early 1800s, the Midwest was opening up. Ohio, which the glaciers did not impact too much, so that you had flat land and you had land with very little stone. When the king gave Connecticut its charter back in the early 1600s, it said that Connecticut, the colony of Connecticut, chartered by the king, was a certain latitude on the globe, and westward to the Pacific Ocean. Nobody had any clue what that meant. So, technically, based on the king's charter, our colony had a north-south piece of land that went right across the continent. When the Ohio and that land opened up, you know, most of that was being settled by Virginians and of course Pennsylvania and other. Connecticut claimed, hey, that's our land. We got the charter. That's our land. In fact, we almost went to war with Pennsylvania over the issue of land out there. But many Connecticut nutmeggers went west, and they went west primarily because it was flatter and easier. If you go to northeast Ohio, there are a number of towns that are named after Connecticut towns, and if you look at those communities, they're set up like New England communities. They really have reminiscent of New England. And in fact, one guy that went out there was from Canterbury, Connecticut, small town in eastern Connecticut, along the Quinnipiac River, and his name was Moses Cleveland. And he took a group of people out there and settled a small village near the lake. And we have a letter from him to his family back in Canterbury. And he says, in the letter, he says, my biggest wish is that someday Cleveland will become as big as Canterbury. And little did he know he'd have the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But, Cleveland is named after Moses Cleveland, who was part of that migration. Another story about that migration, in Bellantoni, Connecticut, which is just as stony as Monroe. There's rock all over the place. Farmer sells his land, he decides to go out to Ohio, he buys a plot out there, and he brings his family out. About 10 years or so later, he decides to come back to see the rest of the family and the neighbors and so forth. So he comes back to Bellantoni, and he's at the local Grange that night, talking to his old neighbors, and of course everybody's, how's Ohio, what's it out there, like that, and so forth and so on. And so at one point in the evening, he kind of reaches into his pocket, and he pulls out a stone about the size of his fist, and he looks at his old neighbors and says, this is the biggest rock in life. And they're all kind of, pack the bags. So it was tough. It was a tough life, and many New Englanders would move. And what that would do, many people think historically that meant that farms were decreasing and so forth. What that actually meant, though, is farmers started to move out. They were selling land to their neighbors. So farms that stayed got bigger and more productive. And you get into the mid-19th century, and you've got some large farms in New England and Connecticut, and they're being, you know, the produce, the production was even greater when we had a lot of small farms. But people left just because of the conditions, and you can't blame them. I'll tell you, you can't blame them. But yeah, that's the biggest rock in my field. Can you imagine?